Okay. Good evening. Excuse me. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight to talk about what is a real and current health crisis right here in Southold town. I am John Carter. I'm the Vice President of the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association, and on behalf of the Civic Association Board, it's our pleasure tonight to host the North Fork Deer Alliance. The North Fork Deer Alliance is a group of experts from the area and the region who for the last 10 years or so have dedicated themselves to monitoring and reporting on the impact of the ever greater deer population on the North Fork and in Southold town. This year, the North Fork Deer Alliance teamed up with other North Fork civic and environmental organizations to amplify the latest deer and tick news, which comes in the form of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's management plan for white-tailed deer in New York State, years 2021 to 2030. We're going to hear several Alliance experts tonight, and before we do, I want to ask you to hold your questions for after the presentation, unless you need a clarification right away. And if that's the case, then please raise your hand, a little yellow hand, and I'll call on you. So thank you for that consideration. After the presentation, which should last about 30 minutes or so, after the presentation, we will answer everyone's questions to the best of our ability, and we look forward to that discussion. Finally, so everyone is aware, we are recording this evening's forum, and it will be available on the Civic Association's YouTube page in the next week or so. The Alliance has given me the honor of opening tonight's presentation. And Barbara, if you're ready and you'll share the cover slide, we'll be ready to begin. There it is. Okay. So the purpose of our being here tonight and making this presentation is to make a positive case for government assistance in dealing with the serious public health crisis, and that's deer overpopulation and tick-borne disease. Next slide, please. Following this introduction, the one that I'm giving right now, our experts will be providing overviews on these key topics: the deer and tick crisis itself, the science of the crisis, and the solution and the proposed action plan for coming to terms with this crisis. Next slide, please. And we're proposing a two-track solution that first utilizes legislative changes recommended in the DEC's management plan for white-tailed deer and available to to Suffolk County and the state. And that second, outline 4 possible ways in which Southold town can participate that are available, affordable, and effective. And more on both of these two tracks later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, as I noted before, and will be noted again, this is a real and current threat to our public health and the environment. And many groups have aligned to confront this threat that is worse today than in any of the last 10 years that the North Fork Deer Alliance has been monitoring it. And if we as organizations, more importantly as a community, if we're to realize a vision of healthy deer, healthy environment, healthy people, healthy town, more action is needed now. So next slide, please, Barbara. As I hand this over to Mark Hobner of the North Fork Environmental Council. Mark.
Thought you were giving me a raise there. Thank you, John. Mark Hobner, I'm the Vice President of North Fork Environmental Council. I'm also the chair of the Town of Riverhead's Environmental Advisory Committee. Our vision is a Southold with healthy deer, a healthy environment, healthy people, and a healthy town. We intend to achieve this by reducing deer to a safe, sustainable level within Southold's 57 square miles of farming and residential community. We have an estimated 6 to 10 times more deer than our environment can sustain. Maintaining this achievable balance can be achieved through recreational deer hunting, professional monitoring, and venison distribution to food banks, seniors, and veterans. Next slide. Southold is in a crisis. John had mentioned the New York State DEC's deer management, white-tailed deer management plan. And they have stated that the deer-related problems in Suffolk County are severe, they are widespread, they're damaging our environment, and a threat to human health. Next slide. These are all the things that we're going to be dealing with topic-wise as we go along, between ticks, the decimated understory, deer collisions, and so on. Next slide. If you take a look at the deer damage to our forests, this is the Hemorrhagic Preserve. If you look at the fenced side on the left, the unfenced side, the exclosure, if you will, on the left, and the protected area on the right, you'll see the absolute striking difference. If we go to the next slide, you will see the Ruth Oliva Preserve, completely damaged, unable to regenerate, no new growth, no new trees, and what one naturalist called an eco-slum. Next slide. We have a collection of testimonies from dozens of Southold residents describing their life-threatening or debilitating tick-borne illnesses and emergencies. One parent from East Marion said, "My 20-year-old son is dealing with a heart condition resulting from Lyme." Next slide. This picture shows for the 18 years of the study, and I'm sure it is larger and greater and further spread now, but it reveals where the problem is concentrated. And if you see Long Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, of course, I don't know why Massachusetts is blank, but I'm sure they have a problem too. And it is here and it is now. Next slide. Mary.
Okay, thank you, Mark. My name is Mary Morgan. I live in Orient. I'm a member of the Orient Association and the North Fork Environmental Council. And some of you may have been aware that we had a survey this summer for 1 month, and close to 200 people responded to the survey. Over 80 sent us personal stories about health threats to their family, friends, children, grandchildren. One respondee said, "I don't want our community to suffer needlessly from increasing levels of tick-borne diseases. Our deer are needlessly suffering from collisions and wasting disease. Our forests are destroyed and unable to regenerate." Next slide. "94% of the respondents said they want Southold to take action, which is very promising. You can see Russ from Mattituck had said he was hospitalized due to kidney failure, which caused Lyme and babesiosis, and he wants us to please take action immediately. Next slide. And let me introduce Arnold Blair, who is the chairman of the Deer Committee of Nassau Point.
Hi, I'm Arnold Blair. Nassau Point is a heavily wooded with very hilly terrain with some very heavily wooded properties. We have been overrun by deer. I joined the Nassau Point Board of Directors about 6 years ago and instituted a program to bring in a deer culling program. And we organized a group of amateur bow hunters, mostly local young men who live and work in this Southold town, supervised by Craig Jobs. This was even before the town hired him. He is now the, I forget his title. He supervises the town deer culls as well. Anyway, our program has been extremely successful. We have instituted some of the programs that the Alliance is now recommending for the entire town to be spread over the entire town. We have a nuisance permit from the DEC, so we can cull from September through March. We incentivize the hunters with a lottery system, which does get the hunters out on a regular basis. And we've had tremendous success for the last 6 years. We've averaged a cull of about 25 to 30 deer per season. And in a small community like ours, it's a great reduction of deer, and all the residents are commenting how successful the program has been. Anyway, going forward, the science, what works and what does not work. Next slide, please. The evidence is voluminous. Here's a litany of studies, scientific studies done by many organizations documenting how the health crisis and the damage to our ecosystem. In particular, Tom Rawinski, who was the U.S. Forest Service expert on the devastation wrought on American forests by greatly excessive deer population, is a supporter of our program. He's nationally known in this area. So the deer are causing a public health crisis that we're all suffering here in Southold Town. Next slide. So the Southold Deer Management Program, which, as I mentioned, is supervised by Craig Jobs, probably harvest between 500 and 600 deer per year. Without this program, our situation, our crisis would be much, much worse. So in the survey, we've asked for response, and we got 58.5% said they would call the town for help hunting deer on their property, and 29.3% said maybe. So that shows a significant support for culling deer in Southold Town. Next slide. So what does not work? Recreational hunting is great, but our densities are too great. Hunting is very time consuming, limited harvest objectives of most hunters who work full-time jobs and just really can get out evenings and weekends. Deer relocation, which has been suggested, no one wants them. It's prohibited now, especially because of the prevalence of the chronic wasting disease. Deer fertility control has been tried by some communities. It's not approved by the DEC. It's unworkable. It requires capturing the deer for injections, tagging them at a cost of about $500 per animal and up. And the efficacy of contraceptives vaccines wears off, so the deer have to be recaptured and booster shots are given. Allow nature to manage deer population. Well, that would be great if we had coyotes and wolves, but we don't. We have no large predators to manage the deer population naturally. Acaricide treatments of lands for tick control. A lot of properties spray for ticks. It's expensive. It's unproven to protect human health. It cannot provide a community-wide solution if only individuals are spraying. Harms other organisms, for example, insect pollinators and aquatic life. People have suggested rodent deticking devices. They're expensive, they're not effective, and they do not detect all the common hosts for ticks. 4-posted deer ticking stations. It's been expensive. It cannot be deployed at the recommended density. It concentrates animals at feeding stations, promoting disease spread between individuals and species. Supplemental feeding promotes deer fertility, so they drop more does each season. A long-running shelter island program did not eliminate the ticks. Next slide. Solution for Southold. Coordinate. Our approach is through the county to approach the DEC and the New York State Legislature, coordinate for legislative changes per the DEC report. They recommend firearms, bait and light, extend the season, compensation, such as we do in Nassau Point with the lottery system for the hunters. We should allow crossbow hunting, which is prohibited, qualified professionals using rifles and other techniques, tax incentive for landowners, trapping, declare a health emergency to aid us in solving and managing the crisis. We also would like to approach Southold Town, with 4 strategies, which detailed on the next slide, which are currently permitted by the New York State DEC. They're affordable, available, and they are proven effective. Next slide.
Is John Rossmuller on the?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
John,
did you want to say a few words?
I'm sorry,
Okay,
was I supposed to? John, I'm sorry if I stepped on your foot.
No problem. You did a very good job of it, Arnold. The town of Southold has a very effective deer management program. It's actually one of the better deer management programs that I'm aware of. However, as it's presently conducted, it's simply incapable of solving our problem. And I'm afraid in another 10 years, we're still going to have the same problems with no improvement. And indeed, the problems could even get worse. For instance, recently there's been the introduction of still another tick species widely in Suffolk County, that being the longhorned tick, which has the potential of being quite problematic going forward. Unfortunately, while the town would like to do more, its hands are pretty much tied by New York State conservation law, which in turn dictates a lot of the regulations that have been issued by the Department of Environmental Conservation. So we're really limited in the town in what we can do in the way of new initiatives, but there are several which are listed on this slide, which have been used elsewhere and are promising. They're not going to solve the problem completely, but they should help us to harvest more deer and reduce the astronomical deer density that we're dealing with at present. One would be to more widely institute an evening hunting program. The upstate community of Trumansburg, under the guidance of experts from Cornell University, designed an evening hunting program that's conducted between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. And this is a time when the deer are moving around more. It would also facilitate getting out in the field to hunt deer. Most of our hunters have full-time jobs, so it's very difficult for them to get out frequently to hunt, and they can't possibly do it every day because of their work requirements. If there was an evening hunting program, more of them might be able to get out to hunt. Another initiative we'd like to see is the planting of forage plots and better management of some of our public parklands. The intent of the forage plots would be to attract and concentrate the deer away from residential communities. As too many of us realize, the deer are living in our midst in the residential communities where it's exceedingly hard to hunt them. If they could be attracted to forage plots in more huntable lands, that might increase the harvest. Also, we'd like to see an expansion in the available lands for hunting. Now, another advantage of forage plots and grassland management is that it enhances other wildlife species, which I think we would all like to see. Previously, it was mentioned that Nassau Point as well as Shelter Island have hunter incentive programs. We think it would be helpful to have a hunter incentive program on a town-wide basis, specifically targeted at increasing the productivity of the hunters. Hunting is expensive, the equipment is expensive, and it takes a lot of time on the part of our recreational hunters. If we can reward them for their efforts, I think it would be very helpful. Finally, both Shelter Island and Nassau Point have run programs to educate the hunters in more productive hunting techniques. We would like to see this made available on a voluntary basis for hunters in the community, and particularly as part of a mentoring process for new hunters. So when they go out in the field to hunt, they can be more successful and increase our deer harvest. These are all steps that could be taken now. They don't require DEC approval. They're permitted under current regulations. However, I would emphasize these are not going to solve the problem by themselves. We have to change New York State conservation law to use more aggressive tactics. And the question there is how to go about it. We in the North Fork Deer Alliance have approached legislators about doing that, and we haven't gotten a lot of cooperation. That's one of the reasons we suggested getting Suffolk County to declare a health emergency in Suffolk because of our epidemic of tick-borne diseases, which truly is an intolerable epidemic. We should not have to live with that risk to ourselves, our families, our loved ones, and visitors every day through much of the year. And if Suffolk County could be convinced to take that step, we see that as being a means of getting the attention of legislators in Albany to make the necessary changes in environmental conservation law. Now, with that, I'll turn it over to John Carter for some final comments.
Thank you very much, each one of you. We really do appreciate your expertise and your attention to this. We're going to move on to questions and comments now. And I want to remind everyone, we want to answer every question. We want to hear all of your comments. And so either place a comment in the chat box, and I will moderate those, but also raise your little blue hand, little yellow hand, and we'll call in that way too. The first question we have is, oops, it just moved off my screen. And this comes from Jean via chat. What happens to the ticks on the deer that are culled? Can somebody answer that one?
Well, the number of ticks on the deer varies with the season. Sometimes of the year, they're loaded with ticks. I suspect a number of the participants have seen pictures of horrendous numbers of ticks on the deer. However, then the ticks mature on the deer, at which point they drop off. And that's a critical step. We have a tick problem because the deer provide an inexhaustible supply of blood to the ticks. And that's necessary for the final maturation of the ticks, the female ticks, so they can lay eggs. So the ticks eventually drop off and lay thousands of, each female tick lays thousands of eggs. So the answer to your question is the number of ticks on the deer will vary with the time of year.
And when that deer is culled, the ticks die.
Yes, correct.
Thank you, John. Another question. Well, my chat box is jumping with all the activity. What are the actual New York State regulations that need to be addressed?
So John, there was one question right before that, which was what are hunter incentives?
Okay. If you would prefer to answer that question first, go right ahead.
I'll take that question.
The most direct incentive was to simply pay a bounty on the deer. And our neighbors on Block Island, which is part of Rhode Island, it's just east of Long Island, they actually have a bounty program where they directly compensate hunters, I think for each whitetail they turn in. That is presently prohibited by New York State conservation law, with one exception. If you can prove that the deer are responsible for spreading disease, then theoretically, bounties could be paid on them. The fact of the matter is, the deer are actually the reservoir hosts for Ehrlichia, which causes ehrlichiosis, which is a very serious disease. And several years back, my next door neighbor contracted ehrlichiosis. He was in intensive care at Peconic Bay Medical Center for 3 weeks. He was advised by his doctors that they nearly lost him to the disease. Now, that's a disease, the deer are the culprits. The deer are carrying the disease. White-footed mice or deer mice have nothing to do with that particular disease. So in that situation, we could institute bounties. However, we'd like to see conservation law amended, and it would not require a major amendment, to say that bounties could be paid on the hosts of the vectors, which would widen it to more than the host for ehrlichiosis. It would recognize that the deer are critical hosts for the several ticks that spread a number of serious diseases for us. So there's that element. Another element that needs to be changed, the state in its wisdom has forbidden sharpshooter culling, which had been conducted in Suffolk County, had been tried. This is an extremely humane way of dealing with excessive deer. We have a situation in Cutchogue. I know of one area in Cutchogue, a field, where roughly 75 deer gather each evening. Well, a bow hunter going out with a bow and arrow, if he's lucky, he could get one. And the rest of them scatter, and furthermore, they're educated to the threat of hunters. A sharpshooter could get a number of them, might get 10, 20 of them in a night. Now, why is this objectionable? It's a humane way of reducing the population, which is inflicting terrible harm on the human population as well as our environment. And I can only point to Princeton, New Jersey, a very progressive community where they use this, and they have a very successful deer management program that incorporates that sort of hunting. I do not see culling as being useful as a routine strategy, because it's not cost effective when the deer population is reduced. It could be extremely helpful in reducing concentrations of deer, which our recreational hunters can't efficiently cope with. So there are a number of steps like this in conservation law that could be and need to be taken.
John, if I could just add something to address
Yes.
a specific question. As John said, we need New York State legislature to change the law to allow a bounty to be paid. But under current DEC regulations, you're not allowed to pay a recreational hunter. So what as we have instituted Nassau Point, and as Shelter Island has a program where there's a lottery system, and the hunters who hunt that week get entry tickets to the lottery based upon some parameters that said either how many deer they've taken or how many hours they've hunted. And each week a lottery ticket is drawn, and one of the several hunters who hunted that week will win in our case, we do American Express gift cards. So it is an incentive. It does get the hunters out there knowing they have an opportunity to earn a nice a gift card.
Thank you. Thank you. Our questions are stacking up here. Next one is from Tom, who asks, crossbows are prohibited in Suffolk and Westchester counties. Why? Crossbows are very accurate and can be used by both youth hunters and elderly ones. Why are they?
Because the state legislature forbids the use of crossbows in those locations. They're highly accurate. They're not dangerous. They're approved for use in adjacent states, but for inexplicable reasons, our state legislature refuses to allow us to use crossbows. Even more ridiculous than that, northern Nassau County has a lot of green space and a developing deer problem. And hunting is not allowed at all in Nassau County. So one has to ask, what are our legislators thinking when they put all of these prohibitions upon hunting? Another advantage of crossbows, it would enable seniors who can't pull a longbow, and possibly some women who would be unable to use a longbow. They could go out and participate in hunting. Furthermore, disabled people as well. Why should we be restricting it only to the super fit who can handle a longbow?
Thank you. We have a question here from Melissa. If forage plots were planted on public lands, how would this be sustained? Wouldn't the deer just eat what was planted?
Correct, they would. Ideally, they would require some tending. I mean, they should be fertilized and invasive plants removed. It's actually a common practice by deer hunters to plant for forage plots. It has been tried to a limited extent in the town of Southold, not by the town, unfortunately, but it does regularly attract the deer. And this is advantageous where you have so many residential communities overrun by deer. Somehow we have to get them out of the communities to places where they can be hunted.
John, just one moment here. Your microphone went really loud there, so you might want to.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Okay. Jay Jensen asks, why hasn't an enormous amount of deer fence been addressed? Increasing habitat by nearly 40% of the North Fork and forcing animals into the residential areas. John, I'm going to put you on mute. You can see if that selects the call.
I don't think there's an answer to that question. The town, I guess the DEC has allowed fencing. It's part of the law. I don't know how you address it. Is the objective to get rid of the deer fencing? Here in Nassau Point, many homeowners have deer fencing because of the inundation that we've had. And most of the deer fencing, I think, is on commercial property, which is protecting the economic interests of the farmers.
Okay, thanks. Next question. And this is from Hazel. We've been hearing about dead deer in the fields and woods, possibly stemming from unverified EHD. I'm not going to try to pronounce that here live, or SARS-2 related to COVID-19. What is known about this, and how could this affect the solutions we are discussing?
That's John's expertise.
Yeah, that's a great question for John, if he can be unmuted.
John, you need to unmute.
John?
John, you're muted. John, I don't know what happened to you.
Well,
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
yeah,
Thank you.
yes.
Okay. The hemorrhagic disease affecting deer has been around for a long time. There, for example, have been periodic outbreaks for many years in New Jersey. Last year, there was a serious outbreak in the lower Hudson Valley that killed something like 1,500 deer. It's spread by midges or gnats that feed on the deer. The current outbreak that we are experiencing in Southold is likely to cease very soon because a couple of heavy frosts will kill most of the that are spreading the disease. The disease is of no concern to humans. It can't be transmitted to us. It's probably advisable for hunters if they take an obviously sick deer, under no circumstances should you consume it. But just simply handling a deer that had this disease is not going to result in its transmission to us. This is a natural event in the natural world. It is not going to solve our deer overpopulation problem, though, because generally the outbreaks are not large enough. They don't kill enough of the deer population to really impact the overall population. Now, there was also a question about SARS-CoV-2, which is responsible for COVID. It has been determined that much of the deer population has been infected with the virus. I mean, a large percentage of the deer population. Whether that can ever be transmitted to humans, we simply don't know. It does indicate that somehow the deer are readily being infected from us.
Thank you. I'm going to now go to somebody who hasn't had a question yet, and I'll get back to those of you who have already posed multiple questions. This one comes from Allison Delaney, who describes this as a selfish question. As I'm a hunter, can someone share the information on the Nassau Point hunting program? Is it open to all town residents or only Nassau Point residents?
It is open to all Southold town residents. It is the organization that we bring in is called Hamilton Archers, and Craig Jobs who is a licensed professional hunter, supervises the Hamilton Archers hunters. So either you can contact Craig Jobs directly at the town hall, or if you want to contact me, I'll give my email address somewhere here. I'll type my email address. You can contact me. I'll put you in touch with Craig, and he has a vetting process, and we will take it from there.
Thank you, Arnold. Okay, let's see. Here's one from Margaret Cruz. What about white-footed mice? Are they as much as a problem as deer as vectors? Although they do not eat all the plants in underbrush, are they a big part of the public health threat?
Well, they are part of the public health threat because they're a major reservoir for the organism that causes Lyme disease. However, I continually hear the problem isn't the deer, it's the white-footed mice. And that indicates severe misunderstanding of the actual problem. White-footed mice are not the only reservoir for the Lyme disease organism. I'm a trained mammologist. I'm used to assessing mammal populations. I have a very good idea of how many white-footed mice live on my property and where they live. Their abundance is far exceeded by pine voles, which are also perfectly competent reservoir hosts for the Lyme disease organism. Many, many more pine voles than white-footed mice. So if we could wipe out all of the white-footed mice or de-tick them, it still would not solve the problem because we have abundant pine voles And furthermore, Shelter Island, I know they have chipmunks, which also carry the Borrelia, the Lyme disease organism. Shrews also carry it. Now, there's another important aspect to this. Some landowners at considerable expense put out Daminex tick tubes to de-tick the white-footed mice. Well, the problem is pine voles and shrews are not going to go into those devices. So if you're only de-ticking the white-footed mice, you're not solving the problem.
Thank you, John. Here's another, I think, a pretty straightforward question. Is aerial hunting allowed in New York State?
To my knowledge, no, but it's a very interesting question because we should take a look at how Texas approaches its massive problem with feral hogs. They hunt them from helicopters. They trap them in baited corrals. They use a number of techniques that we don't even contemplate using in New York. And some of those techniques, I mean, you can get 24 feral hogs in one night in a trap. I don't think we want people flying around in helicopters firing rifles at deer, but where you have serious problems, you have to think creatively about how to solve them. Certainly trapping our deer is something that should be considered where we have huge concentrations of them.
Another question from Jane. How difficult is it to find places to process deer carcasses? Would it be practical to create a business model that would hire people to hunt, no longer recreational hunters, that would process the deer and potentially market the venison as Long Island deer, just as we used to be famous for Long Island duck?
Great idea.
It is a great idea, and there's a lot of sympathy for it in the deer management community, but it conflicts with what is known as I believe it's the North American model of deer management. Selling the venison had been viewed as a no-no. So if you go to a restaurant in New York, you probably can get venison. There's a good possibility it's coming from New Zealand, where they raise them on farms. It would certainly help us in managing the deer problem if venison could be harvested and sold. I mean, with the feral pigs down in Texas and presumably some other states, when they're trapped, they're taken to a slaughterhouse and butchered, and the meat is sold. We're currently not permitted to do that in New York State. Another example of where conservation law is really outdated, and it has to be brought to the modern age where we're dealing with this overwhelming, seriously harmful abundance of deer.
Thank you, John. Let's see, our next question. This comes from Pete. Have there been any proven methods to control deer population using birth control methods?
Okay, probably the best place to look for that, the answer to that question is Fire Island, where an immunocontraceptive vaccine has been tried for years. It was actually originally developed by one of my close friends and colleagues when I was a graduate student up at Cornell. So I have followed it with particular interest. The bottom line is it doesn't work, and there are very good reasons why it won't work. Number one, you have to catch the deer so the contraceptive can be injected. And even by the second year, its effectiveness is already starting to wear off. So you have to catch them again to give them booster shots. I'm sure much of our audience is quite familiar with vaccinations nowadays, so they know what I'm talking about. But there's even a more serious problem. In order for this to be effective, you have to immunize roughly 85 to 90% of the herd within a 2 or 3 year period, because all of the does that have not been immunized are continuing to produce 1, 2, 3 fawns each year. And that is simply impossible to accomplish. I mean, in Suffolk County, we are estimated to have something like 25 to 35,000 deer. How do you catch all of the does in 2 or 3 years at an astronomical cost of like $500 plus to catch each one? So it's simply unaffordable and unworkable. And finally, I should point out, I say this, my doctorate is in reproductive physiology, and I've actually used contraceptives in wildlife. So I'm extremely familiar with the techniques and the limitations. And I simply don't see birth control as being a viable option when you have the deer numbers and density that we have.
Thank you, John. Here's a process question. What is the process to change DEC legislation?
Glad you got to that one, John. And I'm hoping that Mark might start the answer on that one.
I think part of the strategy we had mentioned during this presentation is to bring this to county. We've got support from Al Krupski at this point. We know that there's an issue certainly, and that it has to go to the state in order for these changes to be made. It's going to be a community engagement effort, so that I'm hoping that our 5 towns certainly, and including Brookhaven, and Brookhaven has been affected certainly as well, to expand this to the rest of Suffolk County quickly and reasonably. The DEC is undergoing some changes right now, but again, we've got to rally the troops and get our table larger than it already is, to include the people who are going to be making these decisions, bringing them up through DEC and then to the legislature. And we haven't gotten that far to really have the names in front of us for the committees and the people actually in Albany that we've got to present this to. It's going to be a different presentation in part than what we did today. And we've got to re-strategize, but again, making the table larger and including the people who can actually make the decisions to be at those tables. Thank you.
And I would add that with Al Krupski's help, I mean, he's been very interested in what we're doing and supportive. We do want to ask Suffolk County to declare a public health emergency, which might open some doors for us.
John, I noticed there was a question about the possibility of using dart guns to administer the contraceptive.
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead. And also,
Respond
it
to that?
concludes with castration. What can you tell us about those two?
Okay, dart guns. Number one, you have to get relatively close to the deer, and you could certainly administer the contraceptive that way. However, keep in mind the effectiveness of the contraceptive is going to begin to wear off after a year. And certainly by the 2nd or 3rd year, you're going to have to re-vaccinate the same deer. Well, how do you do that if you don't know which deer have been vaccinated or not? I've discussed this problem at length with Paul Curtis up at Cornell, and he said there's a real problem permanently marking deer. You have to catch them and tag them. So using a dart gun, it might work in the initial administration, but how do you know which deer you've administered the contraceptive to? And then you have to get the same deer again a couple of years, 3 years later. And there was a second issue. Oh, castrating. Okay, that's conceivable. It's not difficult to castrate a male. However, again, you have to catch the male. And the cheapest that I've seen you can catch a deer for is like $500 just to catch one. And that's the low hanging fruit. The more elusive deer, you may spend $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 trying to catch them. And given the number of deer we have, it becomes prohibitively expensive to do that.
Thank you, John. If I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I am, we don't have any questions left in the chat. If anyone has any comments they'd like to make, we're certainly open to hearing them. It doesn't have to be a question.
Comment I would like to say, John, is that we welcome people to send questions or comments to our email, our Gmail. And also, if you're interested in joining, our effort, please let us know. We've typed the address in this chat box, but it's deermanagementcoalition@gmail.com.
Okay, there was another question from Hazel about trapping deer.
Hazel suggests that you could trap the bucks in the enclosures.
Okay,
In advance of.
a big problem with going after the bucks is the bucks are promiscuous. So, for example, Staten Island has a major deer problem, and the approach there, because of political dictates by the mayor of New York's office, they're vasectomizing the deer. However, you have to get almost 100% of the males for it to be effective, because if there's one elusive male still running around, he can impregnate multiple females. So castrating, let's say 80% of the herd, even if it was workable and financially feasible, you'd still have 20% running around inseminating most of the females.
We have a comment here from Allison. Allison, would you like me to read it, or would you? I'll read it for you, Allison. I think a mentorship program is a great idea, perhaps focusing on women and non-binary folks who want to hunt, as well as people of color. These groups I've identified are not the typical hunters, though they are growing sectors of the hunting community. So giving these folks access would be helpful.
Great idea. I would certainly support that before the town deer committee on which I sit.
We have a question here from R. Harper 1. As a first step, how can we encourage Suffolk County to declare the state of health emergency? Very important question.
That's our big challenge. That's what our first goal is. And we're going to work on that through Al Krupski, we think,
Well, one obvious approach might be to the state legislature, and Al could be potentially very helpful because he's a Suffolk County legislator in doing that. Another approach might be through the Suffolk County Board of Health. Ask them to consider doing that.
Just as an addition to that, John, thanks. He is a farmer, and he's not a fan of deer. And part of the fire in the belly that's going to come from him, I think, would sway a lot of people. And he's also aware of the many years that we've been trying to do this. I know a couple of people on this call have been working on this for at least a dozen years.
Absolutely.
And what we're hoping is that a concerted and cooperative approach on this thing is going to make this pass work for us.
Excellent answers, folks. Two more comments have dropped in there, and perhaps this could be a question. Could the town give beginners hunting courses through the town recreation program?
I think the person to discuss this with is Craig Jobs, because he is aware of how to go about this. When when Nassau Point brought in the group that is the sort of hunting club that is presently hunting the point very effectively and with great approval from the residents, they underwent some training by a very experienced hunter who had been trained by probably the best person in certainly the United States, if not the entire world, when it comes to deer management. And Craig participated in that. He knows how it was done. And I think he appreciates the value of it and probably would be receptive to expanding it.
Thank you, John. Allison, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to comment on the hunting courses. I think it's always a good idea to bring them as local as you can. But in my opinion, as a newer hunter, I'm on my 3rd season, it's not so much the lack of courses, because there are quite a few of them that are reasonably well advertised. It's the mentorship, because like someone mentioned earlier in the program, hunting is expensive. You have to get the right equipment. You have to have the right vehicle to transport a harvest. You have to have the right clothing. You have to learn animal patterns. Like, it's really getting out in the field with someone who's experienced to teach you, and I'm, trying not to be too explicit on the call, but to teach you what to do if you even get to shoot a deer. That's a whole process that requires a lot of mentorship, as well as even just getting a sight on a deer and an appropriate shot. So I think it's always a good thing if we can bring more courses to Southold town, and especially focus on populations like women, for example, that often aren't as comfortable in a mixed gender course, just because a lot of men know more about firearms than women. But that being said, just bringing the access is only one part of it. That's where the mentorship is really helpful, to actually get people out on land so that they feel comfortable, doing it by themselves at some point in time.
Let me cascade off of that, Allison. Thank you. There's a group called Babes and Bucks on Shelter Island, and we've met them. The woman in charge of that, I've forgotten her name, I'm sorry, but
It's Julia. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you.
Yep.
Extremely well versed, very calm, and very easy to talk to. And would love, I'm sure, as a sport hunter and a trainer. She's also a firearms safety trainer and hunter trainer. So Babes and Bucks of Shelter Island. I'm going to put a shameless plug in for them.
Yeah, it's actually Long Island Babes and Bucks, believe
Thank
it or
you.
not. So it's across the whole island. It's
Excellent.
women anglers and hunters. Yeah, Julie and I did, we actually did a great course on Shelter Island that the DEC and Mashamik Preserve sponsored in the summer of, I want to say it was 2018. That it was a full day course for beginner hunter safety for all women. It was outstanding. I would love to see Southold town and other townships, and partner organizations do that. It was really well done.
I mean, for example, Allison, one thing we should use more, given the numbers of deer we have, is baiting. Well, there's smart baiting and there's foolish, unintelligent baiting. And this is the kind of thing, someone who really knows what they're doing, ideally they should impart the information on how to do it most productively. When to take the shot and when to pass it up, because you're going to educate other deer in the group, worrying about wind direction, the ideal days on which to do the hunting. These are all important considerations, and to pass that information on from a real expert to newer people in the sport would be highly valuable. And that is one of our proposals, to try to expand that opportunity.
Yeah, the hands-on experience, I think, is really important. And that's what's fun about hunting. It's like a lifelong learning thing. You don't learn it all when you take the course, but you got to get out there to learn. And so, yeah, if we have experienced mentors that can help us, it just allows us to learn more quickly and to take more deer. So I think it's a win-win.
Correct.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, John, Mark, Arnold, Mary, and Barbara. Our time is up. I want to thank the North Fork Deer Alliance, first of all, for all the work they have done and are doing, and for sharing their time with us tonight. I also want to thank everyone who joined us on the call. Excellent questions, lots of really good comments in the chat. And we will post the recording of this forum on the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association YouTube page. And if I can figure out how to do it, then I'll put the chat content on there as well.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just grabbed that as a text file. I will forward that to you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. One item before I let everybody go. The Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association has a public meeting coming up that you might be interested in. It's on traffic, seasonal traffic particularly, and solutions. What are the solutions to that? That meeting takes place on Monday, November 29th. That's the Monday after the Thanksgiving holiday. It's at 6:30 p.m. in person at the Mattituck-Laurel Library in Mattituck. If you want more information, you can get that on the MLCA Facebook page, or you can find it on Mattituck-Laurel-Civic.org, our website. If nobody has any other comments to add.
Thank you, John,
time
for
to say
being
goodnight.
excellent.
Yes,
Excellent.
thank you
moderator.
all.
Very well run, John. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for being here. It's
Bye-bye.
greatly appreciated. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.